Hi everyone, welcome. I'm over here on my computer. I was about to go downstairs into my wormery, but I figured we would start here first just so I can recap the last time we checked in on my two oldest systems. Last time we did that, we created this video here. That was 3 weeks ago now. And what I attempted to do, my plan A in that case, was described pretty good in the title of the video. It was a try at screening the worms out of their castings in my two oldest bins. And I've got that video queued up to show the point in time when Plan A transitioned into Plan B. So I figured I would give you guys a little sense of deja vu by showing that clip here.
I envisioned this being mostly worms and much fewer clumpy castings. And it just seems like even though we've got a whole bunch of other material in here, maybe we do just... Or do we abandon? Really? I don't know.
Alright, well, in case you haven't seen the video, I'm going to spoil it for you. We did abandon the attempt at separating the worms from their castings, and what you see in my hand right there is the reason why. The material was just way too clumpy to pass through the screen, and we really wanted to see worms only in the screen, castings all falling through for the most part, perhaps some larger chunks of debris getting caught with the worms, stuff that could be easily picked out, leftover bits of bedding bits or food scraps, whatever. But we had to, leave that be. But before putting these bins away, we went ahead and we tilled up the material in both bins in order to let the stuff dry out a little bit. We left them uncovered, and for the past 3 weeks they've been sitting there uncovered. And as we mentioned in that video, we did return to those bins a couple times. Well, I did. I didn't make videos about it, but I've got annotations showing it. The most recent one was 7 days ago, where I checked in and stirred the material, trying to bring the more damp material down low out to the surface where it can, shed some of its moisture, sinking the more dry stuff that had been out on the surface down into the rest of the material to help dry it as well. And even prior to that, 14 days ago, so basically I waited 1 week after that last video, did a similar check-in, then last week, 1 week ago today, I did a similar check-in. So those 3 aerations and, leaving the bin uncovered were my attempt at helping this stuff become a little bit more loose so that maybe we could try this one more time. And, while I was in there stirring and checking, I also tried to, break apart little chunks of material that were still holding together because of moisture. Hopefully those efforts all helped. And now we're going to try again. So here's my little placeholder for work to be done on today's date, 0 days, that shows today's date. We're going to give that one more try. We're going to set up the whole system one more time, try, running the material through the screen, try to capture worms, and that leads us down to these systems down here, the open bracket indicating work to be done. We're going to try it one more time. We're going to see if we can get those worms with which to launch off breeder buckets. These breeder buckets have been now sitting there primed and built, ready to go for 4 weeks now, and they're definitely ready for inhabitants. So let's head on down to the wormery now and give this a try. Let's keep our fingers crossed. Hopefully we have better luck today. So I'll see you down there. So up here on the shelf are the 2 bins that we're talking about working on today. Now, as you can see, their start days are only 1 day apart. And the younger of the 2 bins is now 49 weeks of age, 343 days, 344 in the case of the bin that's 1 day older. And, I don't remember seeing dead worms, but in both bins I'm noticing here's one worm, kind of shriveled up, looks pretty bad, hardly even noticeable, its color is so dark. And there's another one over here I even sprayed a little bit of water on the little guy, thinking that maybe, because I saw some kind of pink reddish color to it, thought it might still be alive, and evidently it's not. So I don't remember seeing that during my check-ins to stir the material. I don't know, hopefully everything's okay in these bins. Every time I stirred stuff up, I always found the worms at the very bottom. I guess they're sensing the dryness encroaching from above. So I'm anxious to get this job underway. Let's get these babies up on the bench. We'll start with the older bin, 1 day older than the other one, and we'll see how this goes. So now the arrangement is very similar to what you saw in that short clip I previewed before. It's the screen over here to my right with the bucket that's going to catch any of the castings that pass through. The worms will be caught in the screen, and then I'll drop anything that gets caught in the screen over into this green tray. So, without any further delay, I think we should get started. So here's that unfortunate worm. Oh, am I imagining? I'm not going to take up any more time with that little guy. Hopefully when he's with the rest of the worms, he'll come to his senses if he's still alive. So the whole idea behind doing this way was so that I can try something I've never done before. And every time I've seen the process demonstrated on other worm channels, it seems to go quite quickly. So I don't think it's meant to be a long drawn out process. The material should pass through the screen quite readily, and what should be caught is mainly worms. And I think the other thing here is that I should just expect that there are still going to be clumpy chunks of castings still holding together due to excess moisture, but it still seems to me like there's going to be a good amount of stuff that does end up down in the bucket. So I didn't want to let the presence of this guy doesn't look too good either. I didn't want to let the presence of any of this clumpy stuff distract me either. I figured later on, all that stuff, once it's separated from the actual castings that do pass through the screen, we could more easily tend to their needs a little bit more in a more specific way, which is to just try to crumble this stuff up once all the stuff that is loose enough to pass through has passed through. So I think the other thing is to empty this regularly enough so that the worms don't end up diving down and ending up in the castings. So I do have a feeling this is going to wind up being a pretty good pile of clumpy material along with the worms, even though it would have been kind of nice to see worms only. That does seem pretty unlikely, and it does seem like things are getting kind of dry in this container. So it does seem like high time we got the worms out of here. Now, since I'm attempting to run breeder bins with the worms that we capture here, my goal is to get mainly adult worms, larger sized worms. But since there's been no food, no moisture added, some of these worms might be sort of losing mass, becoming a little bit more puny in size, dehydrated a little bit almost. So my hope was that not too many of them pass through the screen based on their, because of their small size. To me, it seemed like any little ones that do pass through the screen and end up in the finished castings would just get rounded up later. Maybe I'd run a migration of the worms out of the material, kind of set up a horizontal feeding zone for them, and then they'd be able to, migrate out of this material into a nice feeding zone full of moisture and food for them. And I believe they're going to be pretty heavily motivated to get out of this stuff and into some fresh bedding where there's some food and moisture for them. So I don't know. I think the best bet here is to not allow myself to get derailed. I used, the clumpy castings as just an example of one of the things I sort of anticipated and decided on as not being a reason for me to, stop. I figured I would just accept the fact that there is going to be a good bit of clumpy material along with the worms, and then they would just, pass through that stuff, dive down out of the bright lights, and I could do like a quickie little light separation of the worms from that stuff. And that's just the way I would handle that stuff, and then that stuff could be sort of more, easily processed and crumbled up perhaps. I could just maybe hold it in my hands and sort of try to break up any stuff that's still clumping together that way. I think the key here is just to bring an end to these systems. At 49 weeks, we're only 2 weeks away, no, 3 weeks, I'm sorry, 3 weeks away from these systems running for an entire year. And that's saying something in my wormery, because my worm bins, at least maybe a year and a half ago, maybe perhaps even as recently as a year ago, for me running a worm bin up to an age of, say, 150 was already starting to seem like kind of old, you know. So I started running a lot of my systems up to 200 days, and the fact that these are now, you know, close to a year old now, almost 350 days of age, it does seem like I've, you know, kind of achieved my objective, which was to try to lengthen the lifespan of my systems and not try to bring them to completion as quickly as I had in the past. So that's pretty cool. In fact, that other system that you might have noticed, there was another tray up on the top shelf over there next to where these two bins that we're going to be working on today are. And that's actually the castings from the last red wiggler bin that I separated the worms from. In that case, I used the light separation method, and I made reference to it a moment ago. It's where the bright lights overhead cause the worms to dive down into the dark material below, and then what you do is you skim off the castings, and eventually what you're left with is just a pile of worms at the bottom. And that might be the way we get the worms separated from this clumpy material in the end. It does seem like the sensible way to play it. So let's just try to keep the momentum of this going. The whole idea of me wanting to try this approach was that it did seem like a significant time-saving method versus the light harvesting method, because when you do use the approach where you give the worms a chance to dive down out of the bright overhead lights, that could sometimes take a while, you know. Sometimes the worms, you know, need a moment or two to react to the bright lights. Maybe you need to disrupt the material a little bit on the top surface so that they notice that there's bright lights shining overhead, triggering their, you know, their behavior of diving down to get out of the bright light. So the whole idea by trying to use this approach was to save time, you know. I mean, ultimately we are giving all these little guys quite a jostle by putting them in the screen and separating them from their castings in this fashion. So I'm sure it's a little bit traumatic for them. Hopefully not too much. That's why I kind of wanted to just do it quickly, get it over with, try to limit their distress and discomfort from being manhandled this way. And I must say the castings are starting to pile up because the red bucket is getting pretty heavy, but we're almost there. We're almost done screening all this material in this system. Just that the worms are sort of sticking to the screen here. I am attempting to get them all over into the worm collection green tray before I do the next handful. But it's a little bit difficult. They're sticking a little bit, but we're almost there. We're almost at that point where we've processed this tray already using this method, and the castings obviously are going to have a good number of worms that fell through the screen with the castings. We're just going to, like I mentioned earlier, we're going to try to bait them out of that material using sort of a migration method. And I was even thinking we would just combine these castings with the material that's up on that other bin that's up on the shelf, that's holding onto the castings from the last system that I light harvested. Because in that case, I felt like I was seeing lots and lots of cocoons, so I sort of held onto the, oops, all right, sorry about that. Try to get this back in place. So I held onto those castings rather than putting them straight into storage, so that perhaps the cocoons that I observed in the material would have time to hatch, and then there'd be baby worms. And that was probably over 4 weeks ago at this point, perhaps even longer. And that should be enough time for any cocoons that might have been placed into the material by the worms, even ones that were placed pretty late in the game, to have hatched by now. So I think the next step of trying to round up the worms in that batch of material is also due. So that's pretty opportune, where we can just take this material that's piling up in the red bucket and also try to round up the worms from this stuff as well. So I figured all the castings collected from the already harvested system from a few weeks ago, as well as the castings from these two systems, would all just be, combined into that one tray up on the shelf, and that I would set up a horizontal migration feeding zone for them. And I've got a feeling all the worms are going to be pretty highly motivated to find themselves a nice fresh place to hang out with some food and some nice moisture. So I believe I'm going to see about dumping out this last little portion of material by simply turning the I don't know, I'm obstructed by the low ceiling here. Perhaps I could do it down here. Doing it over the bucket didn't seem like it was going to work. And, this is close enough for what we're trying to accomplish here. Give this material... Jeez Louise, I'm not having a lot of luck today. Well, I guess there is a certain amount of muscle memory from doing certain things on a regular basis, and my screening system just hasn't been getting much use lately, because my preferred method of getting worms separated from their castings is generally the migration approach. So let's see about collecting up some of this mess I've been creating here over the past few minutes. Alright, well, I think I've kind of included enough dialogue and narration to last two systems, so perhaps I can just do the second bin sort of in fast motion without subjecting you to all the nitty-gritty details of getting the job done, because you already kind of get the gist of what we're trying to accomplish here. It's just going to be kind of a repeat of what we did here now. But it certainly does seem like we've got a pretty good number of worms in here. It would be very interesting to see how many of them start to dive down out of this material. And since I think separating the worms from this material, kind of using a light separation method, maybe I can just pile them all up over on one side, and after they all retreat out of the bright lights down into the material, I could start scraping off some of the material on the top. Maybe that's the way to play it next, and then I will really have sort of a separated batch of material here before I proceed down into doing the next system. So why don't we do it that way? I guess we'll just leave the camera running so you guys can check out what's happening here. I'll just bring it up a little bit closer so you can see, and then I'll pick up on this in a moment. I do notice a few worms here that just appear to be completely unfazed by the bright lights overhead, kind of making me question if they're even still alive. I guess any worms that are still sort of sitting around, not trying to retreat out of the bright lights, could possibly not even be living anymore. So these two really caught my eye because there just seemed to be no movement out of them whatsoever. This little guy seems to have some movement. Or maybe not. Kind of made me wonder if perhaps just a quick little bit of moisture would sort of help them snap snap out of it if they are still alive, but they might not be. So I'm definitely seeing some movement out of the one in the middle, the lighter colored one. Perhaps just doesn't have the energy to retreat down into the material. Poor little guy. Let's get him back into the mix with the rest of his family. The other two, I'm not seeing any movement, regrettably. So they might have met their end, the poor little guys. Here and there I'm seeing some material that looks like it might not even break down, so it doesn't even need to stay with the worms. So, I guess I'm interested in figuring out what to do with what's in here, because the material has taken us to the point where there's not enough room to process another container's worth of stuff, and it might make sense to place this over into that container where we thought we might try to be migrating worms out of soon. So why don't I set this aside here briefly. I'll bring out that other system that I made reference to a moment ago. It's right behind me here. And the material that I harvested is covered up. It was harvested in a much more methodical fashion with the assumption that far fewer worms were left behind in it. However, like I said earlier, I did assume that all the cocoons that I saw in the stuff would be hatching over time, and that there'd be the presence of some baby worms. Every time I've peeked under the plastic here, I've spotted baby worms kind of collecting on the plastic, which is where any moisture in the system would attempt to any moisture in the system attempting to leave by evaporation would get caught and would condense on the plastic. There was a point in time when I checked on this thing and it was, not covered, but I definitely saw lots of baby worms. And if you look at some of these baby worms, I'm not even sure the camera's capable of picking them up with the wide angle lens that I've got it set to right now to show more. But some of these little guys, they are really puny. Sometimes I use the eyelash as a way to refer to their size, because they are about the size of your eyelash when they're really young. And that's not just their length. I mean, their thickness is almost as thin. They're just really tiny little baby worms. And they are here for sure. And I see them. It's kind of a shame that the plastic is pink because they blend in so good. I'm hardly able to see them. But I am spotting one here or there. And I guess maybe just from the bright lights overhead they're starting to move a little bit, so that sort of helps me to spot them too, kind of reveals their position on the plastic. So I wasn't quite sure how to tackle getting all of them off the plastic. So I would imagine that the material on the plastic is going to dry pretty quickly, leaving the worms in an environment that could be pretty dangerous to them. A little worm this size probably has very little moisture content, can probably dry out in a moment's notice, which we don't want to see happen. So perhaps the best bet here would be to actually fold this plastic in half so that whatever moisture is on here can remain. And all this other stuff was just materials that came out of the maintenance of other systems, so they're just sort of being stored here temporarily. But it was in this system that I thought we'd be able to drop our collected castings. It does seem to me like we've got space enough in here to possibly put this much in there, as well as another amount that's equal to this. And then any baby worms that have, hatched in this material from the cocoons that I was spotting in it would have an opportunity, along with the other worms that we've got in here that just fell through the screen, to all get collected up into a migration zone that we would set up on the edge of the bin. So I think to get our screening tool sort of reset and available for processing the next system, I think it's time to empty it into here, because I believe that is going to be the best bet for rounding up all these red wigglers in all these castings. Here and there, though, I keep running into little bits of blue plastic of some sort. Somehow got caught in my shredder and ended up in my prepared bedding mix, and I've been fishing it out of a lot of my systems. And I guess a worm this size would be one that actually sort of snuck through, was not actually was not actually born in here. So my process for collecting these castings was obviously imperfect, because besides the babies born from cocoons that I saw in this material, we obviously have some worms that are even larger and more mature than that. I was just trying to get a sense of how this system might look if it was loaded with 2 more systems worth of castings. Trying to envision what's in here already as perhaps occupying only 1/3, and what goes in from here would occupy perhaps another third, and then we would almost be at capacity here, leaving very little room for the setup of a horizontal migration feeding zone. But even though we're going to be pretty close to the limit of this bin's storage capacity, I think it's doable, so I think we're just going to go for it. Let's do it. Let's see how we do emptying our collected castings with the worms in them into here. I guess we'll have a chance to sort of pick through the stuff a little bit. It feels so much drier than this other stuff over here that was pulled out of the other material. And you can see a good number of worms snuck through the screen. I guess when I see them, or if they're in larger numbers, no, you know, I'm not going to bother. I think the worms we collected and the worms that we're going to collect from the next system should be sufficient to launch off our breeder systems. So why don't we just proceed to getting the other bin up here and processing that as well, collecting the castings from that, separating the worms to the best of our ability, and then we'll get a chance to see how many worms we were able to round up in this effort. I'm starting to get a feeling like it's going to be a pretty good number. And I do feel like we've got space enough in here, hopefully, to fit 1 more bin's worth of castings in here. So I'm going to reset what we've got here, but only after I've checked out what's in here. There's still a few worms left behind. Don't want to leave them in here. And then we'll pick up where we left off with the next bin. So now I wasn't really paying attention, and I just went ahead and I got to work on bin number 2. I just wasn't paying attention. I went ahead and I sort of separated all the not all the worms, but I did my best to separate worms from the clumpy chunks of castings that all got caught in the screen last time. So I've got a tub here. They've already kind of started diving down into the pile, leaving behind the castings on top that came along with them. For the most part, though, this is worms, and then all the other stuff, the clumpy stuff, is over there, and then I've got like a sort of mix of that. And in the meantime, I was picking out larger chunks of this and that. So I'm about to begin screening here, bin number 2. So just like before, I'm going to try to breeze through this as quick as I can, just to do the 1-2 separation and see how quickly I can be done with it. Wow, okay, so this stuff definitely a lot drier, and yeah, I must admit the stuff that we're seeing here on the first pass is all that large chunk dry material that was out on the surface. Not too surprising that we caught a lot of debris in here, and virtually no worms actually. In fact, I'm wondering if right now would be a good time, really quick, just to separate any worms I can find in that material that we just did in the first pass, and just set that stuff aside, because most of it is large chunk stuff, which yeah, you know, I'm not going to worry about it. We'll just deal with it all in one shot later. So onward, let's get this job completed. Alright, well, I think that's that. We've got the job done. What's left behind, I believe, is just a few castings stuck to the container, no worms. Which means we've once again got a collection in the red bucket. A collection that actually appears to be a little bit more than what we got out of the previous container. I don't remember. This stuff might have been, I don't know, there might have been a little bit more in this tub than the other one or something. But it did seem like I was coming to the top of the container a lot more quickly in here as far as the red bucket goes, filling up the red bucket. So I believe, like we did before, we're going to see about taking all that castings material out of the red bucket and placing it into the bin where we're going to try to migrate the worms that fell through the screen. And as you can see, quite a number of them did. All the small worms fell through, and a good number of larger sized ones too. So there's going to be a number of worms to be migrated out of these castings. I guess the nice thing about this stuff is that it's free of all this large chunk stuff, all this clumped up material, but we do also have a good number of worms that we managed to collect over here. So I think in the other bin we already went through the whole emptying of this, didn't we? I don't know. Let's just do it. Let's get the other container out here. Oh my goodness, this stuff is starting to add up, because castings do have a good bit of weight to them, and I sure hope I don't end up overflowing here. Hopefully we could fit it all in. Let's see how that goes. Okay, I think we made it fit pretty neatly in here. There is going to still be the need for a little bit of extra space so that we could set up a migration zone for these worms to be attracted over into. And where that's going to be, I can't tell quite yet, because we are pretty much at capacity in here. It seems like it might be pretty difficult to try to set up a horizontal migration feeding zone, perhaps bait boxes or some other sort of approach which would allow me to just manage it from above, and hopefully the worms will come out for that. That might actually be the better solution here, because then the worms would be drawn to like some central spot rather than perhaps the far edge of the bin that they can't even tell is perhaps you know, a place that they would want to go to. So I don't know, maybe another option would be to split this material across two containers and try to migrate worms out of it using something of a less at capacity situation than what we got here. But yeah, we got ourselves 3 harvested systems worth of castings here, and my goodness, this thing is heavy. Wow. And I guess until I figure out what to do as far as getting the worms out of that stuff, I might as well cover it with plastic, because there's really no there's no need to let that stuff continue drying. It's already quite dry the way it is. So one thing I didn't show was how I managed the separation of the worms from all this large chunk material that got caught in the screen along with the worms. It was more or less a light separation. I waited until all the worms went down into the material here, and then I scraped off the stuff resting out on top, and some of it was material that I was able to just pull chunks out, like uncomposted pieces of bedding and food, and then the rest of the stuff I tried to collect as just a collection of the little chunks of castings material. So it took a little bit of doing, but I was kind of picking out all the little stuff like this to keep it, you know, separate. And I've got a little collection of this sort of stuff piled up over there, stuff that never really got completely broken down. This will just end up going back into another red wiggler bin, I guess, somewhere to continue on. It was also a good opportunity because I was able to pull out other things like these unusual little blue plastic pieces that somehow got caught in my shredder. All these little blue strips of something. keep appearing in my systems, and it's stuff that's never going to break down because it just keeps showing up. So every time I see it, I pull it out. So I'm going to process this stuff similarly, but it is a time-consuming process. Got to let the worms dive. So I think we're almost at that point where we're going to have a collection of worms that we can release into our breeding systems. So I'll take a little break, let these worms dive, pick up where I left off, and then we'll continue the video at some point later when things get interesting again. So now to try to reduce some of the clutter down here, I've gone ahead and I've taken the time to rinse out the 2 containers that all these worms were living in. So the worms that were in container number 1, the older container, the 344-day container, they're the ones over here. And the second container, the bin that we left off with a moment ago, is the one that's right here, the 343-day, the 49-week-old container. So those bins are both washed, clean, ready for their next commissioning of worms. And I've also taken some time over here to, so basically this pile, I just started sweeping material off, waiting for the worms to sort of pile up on the bottom here, and back and forth, all the while picking out large chunks of unbroken down bits of bedding and food, whatever I can pull out. So we're starting to amass another collection of the stuff that we considered as the little wet boulders that wouldn't screen through. And I'm almost at the point where I believe we can probably even do one more little scraping off of some of the material that's covering up the pile of worms here. And then we could scoop these little guys out of here. And then I'll probably go through another round of this, kind of letting the worms dive down into this pile again. Perhaps while I'm letting that happen, I can just pick out some of this material over here. And then go for another sweep across. And that'll hopefully leave us with another pile of worms at the bottom of this. Probably not quite as big as this pile of worms here, because I was giving them a good bit of time to dive before I would sweep the material over here. It was just once in a while I would do kind of a larger wholesale sort of sweeping of the material over there. And it was at those times that I believe a larger quantity of worms might have ended up over in that pile. But I'm sure that that pile has a far smaller quantity of worms in it than this. So at this point we're going to start joining these 2 worm populations together. So now, just referring back to the label, these are the worms that actually got recruited out of my compost barrel when the compost barrel was repaired. And I guess when the worms sort of come from sort of an out of the ordinary place, I treat them as a little bit different. But at this point they're just going to be blended in with the rest of my red wiggler population. So I won't be trying to distinguish them as a separate batch of worms any longer. So here we've got a good bit of additional worms to add to our collection here. And I think I'm going to be able to give these guys on this pile over here another few minutes to dive, and then I'll do another sweep of the material, see if we can round up just a few more, and then at some point I guess we'll just consider this as another collection of the little boulders and stuff that we can include over here. But it would be nice to also at the same time keep picking out some of this stuff here. So I'll continue on with that, see if we can clean this stuff up so that in the end what we've really got is just some kind of damp boulders of castings. Although I'm usually suspicious of a little boulder like this, because usually when you break one of these things open, there's usually some little chunk of something in the middle of it, kind of causing all the castings to stick to it. So I think that even if we were to take all these relatively clean boulders here where you don't see a whole lot of debris like what we've been collecting here, if we were to break all that stuff up, if it were to dry a little bit, I'm sure we would find a whole bunch of little bits of bedding and leftover food and stuff like that. So I guess I'm just going to continue on here. I suppose if I find a couple of worms here and there, I can pick them out and drop them in with the rest of the crowd. Ones that are sort of out here on the surface. But we're getting there gradually. It would be nice at this point soon to have the worms that we're going to launch off our breeder buckets with. I mean, effectively, I believe we've probably already got plenty to do each bucket, because I set each bucket up with about 2 gallons worth of bedding. And in an ideal breeding environment, you want to put about 100 worms into each gallon of bedding material to get that breeder environment optimized. So that means I would only need about 200 worms per bucket, which means what I need to get this job done is 1,000 worms. And if you ask me, we've probably got 1,000 worms in here. I mean, the ideal situation would be that they're all adult worms and no juveniles, but I just really don't have the patience, I think, to try to figure all that out. I mean, last couple times I've done breeder buckets, I've just gone with what I estimated to be the right number of worms, perhaps padded a little bit with the knowledge that I knew that it wasn't completely adult worms. And I think that's what we're going to do here as well today, because I don't really think I've got the tolerance at this point. This has been going on for quite some time now, if you haven't noticed. Yeah, there was bright sunshine streaming into here earlier. At this point, it's almost dark. Sun's almost about to set. And yeah, at this point, I'm just thinking split this container up 5 ways, drop an equal number of worms into each breeding bucket, and call it a day. So maybe I'll just leave these little guys here to dive down into this pile at this point. I've picked out a good number of residue bits and pieces. So I think we can maybe let this pile settle down before I begin sweeping it over to the other side and trying to amass perhaps one more little batch of worms to pull out of here. And then we can proceed to launching our breeder bins. Nice little collection of worms in here. Okay, we're in the home stretch now. So where I stand is that I've got all the worms out of both systems here in this box here. And this box is what I refer to as, at least on this thing here, it's the dishwasher detergent box right here. And at one point I had taken the weights of all the typically used containers, and that was one of them. So we're going to use that weight. It's 4 ounces. I'm going to go with ounces, and we're going to give that load a quick weigh just to get a sense of how many worms it is that we ended up with here. So I'm just trying to protect the scale from getting any sort of filth on it. So now this is in kilograms mode. Let's just switch over really quick to pounds and ounces. And, well, 1 pound, 12 ounces. And then we deduct the 4 ounces for the dishwasher detergent container. That leaves us exactly 1.5 ounces. And, well, not exactly 1.5 ounces, because there's castings in there too, right? So either way, I think that's kind of good. It works out. Let's just say wait. Let's do that one more time. Yeah, okay. So, I mean, if we account for maybe 1/4 pound of this being castings, that means we've got 1¼ pound of worms in here. And if we divide that up 5 ways for the 5 breeder bins, it's 1/4 pound of worms per breeder bin, which actually turns out to be just about what we were looking for. All right, so let's see. I think I actually misspoke earlier. I think I said I need 1 pound of worms to get this job off the ground. I think what we've got here is going to work out just right. So as far as this stuff goes, I got a feeling once this stuff dries a little bit, I'll be able to crumble it all up and it'll be almost all castings. So I'm just going to set this stuff aside, I bet you within a day or two it'll dry up enough and I'll be able to break it up. And then this stuff here, this was all the large chunk material that got caught in the screen, the stuff that I picked out. I think I mentioned earlier that stuff can probably just end up in a red wiggler bin somewhere. This came in pretty handy. So this is what I was keeping all the large chunk little boulders in until I ran out of space. That's when I poured it over into the green tub, and at this point I've got my buckets here, so I'm going to just go ahead and grab, I don't know if it's visible here, I got them all labeled as buckets 1 through 5. This is bucket number 1, and if you look inside, this stuff's been set up for, I don't know, what did it say on the spreadsheet? 4 weeks now? And that included food, and it was interesting because down where the food had been, I don't know, bacteria, microbes, whatever, I don't think there's any worms in here. Maybe fungus. Something appears to have eaten the food. Because I look inside each of these containers and there's a big void where the food items had been placed. So a little bit unusual, but I think it's time to get the show on the road. Time to start launching off these containers. I think if I go with exactly a 1/4 pound over here in each of these, we should be good. So let's not waste any more time. Let's just grab what appears to be a reasonable number of worms. See how much we ended up with here. 4.5 ounces. I don't know if that's too much. I think that's about right. So let's launch off bin number 1 with these worms. Whoa, I almost knocked that tray off the table. Now I know when I was running these yellow buckets as everyday systems, they weren't the most popular. It's a little bit difficult to see what's going on inside of them. But I think just for the sake of launching off the system, it should be fine just for the inaugural launch. And I might not even do any sort of updates with these systems. Maybe I'll come in and feed them once in a while, but sort of like when I did the breeder buckets for the European night crawlers recently, I didn't really do anything in terms of check-ins or videos. We just left them be, and I think that's what we're going to end up doing here as well. So I'm going to let these guys be. Hopefully they could settle in. I didn't really aerate the material in these bins. Hopefully they could sort of slither out of the bright lights, get down into the bedding that's just been sitting here priming, waiting for them for all this time. And while they settle in, I'm going to weigh out the next container's worth of worms so we can get the other 4 going as well. Alright, well, I think that's enough of that. We're not going to sit here waiting for all these little guys to settle into their new home. I'm simply going to cover up and get bin number 2 out here, or better said, bucket number 2. So these things got a good amount of weight to them because it's, I don't know, I kind of came in here with a good amount of moisture. I really wanted these to be nice and cozy for the worms. And I think you could probably see here too, we've got the, I guess I've been going sort of 4.5 ounces. I think that should work out, right? And, I don't know, hopefully we don't leave ourselves short on the last container. So I guess I'm just factoring in the extra weight of the, you know, the container itself to a certain degree. So here too, launching off breeder bucket number 2. I usually just like to spread the worms out a little bit just so they don't have to sit there in a huge pile, one on top of the other. They all kind of have direct access to the material right below them so they can squirm down out of the bright lights and not have to freak out too much. And I'll start weighing the worms for bucket number 3. Okay, here again, I'm going to cover these guys up because I'm all set to release the worms that I weighed out for bucket number 3. And let's see, I guess I'm just trying to flash the number that's been written onto each of these buckets really quick so you can see each one as we release the worms into it. I sure hope we don't end up shortchanging the last bucket. I guess we'd be better off if we ended up with a little surplus of worms in the end, with the way I'm weighing this stuff. And then I could just sort of divvy those last few worms out to the to all the systems evenly. Once again, I always feel like I want to sort of spread these little guys out a little bit and let them all have fair access to the material below so they could get out of view, and I'll start weighing the worms for bin number 2. No, bin number 4. Wow, we're coming along. Alright, yeah, I was a little bit worried that the material in these bins was going to be a little bit dry and inhospitable, so I think I might have gone overboard almost in terms of dampening the contents, because these things really have a good bit of weight to them. That's for sure. So, onward to bin number 4. So, I am getting the sense that we're going to be in good shape as far as having enough worms to release into all the containers. I'm just a little bit curious to take a look at what's going on. Yeah, look at that. There's like a puddle down in here. Ay, ay, ay. Ooh, wow. Well, you know what? I might just have to leave these things uncovered because there is standing water at the bottom. That kind of explains why it was so heavy. And I don't think the worms are going to mind the least bit, because they're going to actually probably love that. Because, you know, for quite some time now, they've just been sitting in their tubs with no feedings, no moisture. The tubs have been just drying out gradually, and I think these worms are going to be thrilled at the prospect of having this much moisture at their disposal. I think they're all going to go for a little bit of a bath. I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah, you know, I could tell right away when I lifted these buckets up how heavy they were. Because when I ran these as regular worm composting systems, I was picking these things up on a regular basis. We were making videos of them, peeking down into the buckets as I fed them, as I maintained them. But people weren't really thrilled with that video footage because it was kind of cramped, you know. It was cramped quarters working on those systems. I think we had European night crawlers running in them. So this is the last of the 5 breeder buckets, and it does seem like we worked things out quite nicely, because all I've got left is a pretty puny little handful of worms. It seems like every time I went to go pick up a handful of worms to put them on the scale, a good bit of the castings just remained in the other box. Because like the worms all stuck to one another and all the castings just fell off of them. So what was left behind is, yeah, a few worms that didn't get allocated to any of the 5 buckets, but a whole bunch of castings too. So I think the remaining worms that need to be kind of assigned to, you know, one or another bucket is fairly minimal. You know, perhaps a few dozen. I'll show you once we let these little guys settle in for a moment, get them covered up and remove them from the bench, and I'll show you how many worms were left over. And then I think that'll be the end of the video. I'll take care of assigning those last few leftover wormies a place to live, and we'll be finished. All right, and that's that. You know what I forgot to do? I forgot to make labels. I guess that's going to be an off-screen activity as well. Usually it's customary for me to make labels like the ones we removed from the 2 old trays that these little guys got removed from. Usually we christen all of our new systems with new labels when we're commissioning them and launching the worms into them, but I don't have them ready, and I don't want to prolong the length of this video anymore because it is going to be quite huge. So besides a little pile of castings on the bottom, there's a few worms. So I would say if I were to take maybe this many worms and drop them into each container, that would be a pretty fair divvying up of the remaining worms that didn't get allocated into a breeder bucket. So we'll take care of bucket number 5 since it's right here, but I'll take care of the others once we stop rolling. So that was interesting. Took quite a long time, and I'm curious what it's going to be like editing this video. It's going to take some time. There's a lot of footage. But I'm not going to keep you around for that because that's boring. No, actually I enjoy video editing. But that's it for the video. As far as I'm concerned, it's also Miller time. I'm ready for a brewski. What a long day. Alright everyone. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. I'll take care of getting stuff put away and cleaned up. But before I go really quick, let me just quickly say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's very much appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.